Hello, this is Alexis Carter, and in this lecture, we're going to be talking about building effective healthcare information technology teams, as well as effective communications. These are the topics that we will be covering. We're going to start off this lecture with Section 4B, which is also Section 4.2 in the core content. This has to do with building effective interdisciplinary teams, and as we all know, this is an incredibly important skill in clinical informatics. Much of the content in this lecture is certainly common sense. However, because you will be taking a board examination on this material, I've also included some theories and named strategies that you should be familiar with prior to taking the board exam. Questions you should be prepared for are methods of recruiting and retaining employees and team members, what are the human resource factors for healthcare IT teams, and factors critical for team effectiveness. You should also be familiar with methods on how to structure your team's goals to promote their effectiveness, on processes that are commonly employed in group management, as well as how to manage team meetings successfully, and also techniques for managing group deliberations. Let's begin with human resource management. Human resource management begins with planning the human resources that you need. The first thing that you need to do is to identify the objectives of the team that you're planning for and identify what resources are needed in order to meet the objectives. Resources can include individual talents, their expertise, the specific skills they may have, as well as the overall size of the team. In a healthcare information technology team, you're going to want to pay particular attention to their technical skills, specifically computer skills, and you want to look at their skills in your current system as well as any system that you're planning on bringing on in the future. You need to make sure that you have adequate subject matter experts, including nurses, physicians, technologists, and others. While these individuals may not have the technical information technology skills that you need, but no one understands workflow like the people who are actually doing it. So obviously these individuals are critical for those considerations. You'll also need project management expertise, and hopefully, because you're taking this particular board exam, you also recognize that you need informatics expertise as well. If you're in a position where you are creating a new team, it's important to formalize the process of team assembly. It's also equally important to make sure that during that process you're following your existing organizational policies and procedures, because that really can save you time and headaches later on. Developing job descriptions for each individual or role on the team is critical. That job description should include qualifications, duties and performance expectations, reporting requirements, and organizational responsibilities. It's also important to consider whether you want to recruit internally versus hire from the outside. In this slide, I've made a table showing the advantages and disadvantages between internal recruitment and external recruitment. The advantages of recruiting internally are that the personnel inside an organization obviously are already familiar with the organization's history. Similarly, the organization is already familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of that particular employee. They know whether or not they can trust this person, and an internal recruitment may also be more cost effective because moving expenses would not be involved. So they're effectively a known operator. The disadvantages of an internal recruitment are that you may spread your internal talent too thinly. I know I personally have seen situations where an internal employee wasn't completely relinquished from their prior duties before taking on a new position within the organization, and that does run the risk of spreading your internal talent too thinly. In addition to that, personnel who are internal, and particularly if they have been with the organization for some time, may be rooted in cultural behaviors or approaches to problems that may not be very effective. The advantages of hiring an external individual are that you can hire specific talent if you don't have it already in-house. And this can be really useful if you have internal talent which is already spread too thin, or you simply don't have a person with that skill set within your organization. External hires can also bring a very fresh perspective. They've been in other organizations and may see how things have been done in different ways. The disadvantages of an external recruitment are that an external hire can cost you additional money from the perspective of moving expenses, and also if they have a skill set which is much needed or desired and which your organization doesn't already have, then the laws of supply and demand may go into effect. External hires also may not know your institution's culture or pertinent organizational history, so their ramp-up time can be slower, and their true abilities and weaknesses are not always known when they're hired. When managing your human resources, obviously recognition and rewards are very important, and you want to apply those when you have seen desirable behavior and completion of work. Rewards can be tangible or intangible, and tangible rewards are usually the same thing as extrinsic motivators. This could be money, it could be public recognition, or even some kind of gift or prize. Intangible rewards are usually intrinsic motivators, and this is just a reminder that we cover motivation in far more detail in the leadership lecture, which is section 4A. Intrinsic motivators or intangible rewards are those opportunities for growth, education, new challenges, or things that just make people feel valued. And these motivators are far more valuable and long-lasting in effect than tangible rewards, otherwise known as extrinsic motivators. The other thing to point out is that small rewards given periodically are shown to be more effective than one large reward at the end of a big project. So if you're in the middle of an EHR upgrade or an implementation, it's really important to reward hard work at smaller increments along the way rather than to wait until after go live. Performance reviews. Every time I ask people who are taking the live course how many people in the audience enjoy doing performance reviews, as you might expect, no one raises their hand. But I think all of us realize how important giving a good and fair performance review is for our employees and staff. The most critical thing about performance reviews is to realize that they are best done when they are measured against predefined objectives, cost boundaries, and timeliness, which were understood by the employee at the beginning of the assessment term. Performance reviews should have indicators which allow the evaluator to rank a demonstrable skill and competency improvements. Performance reviews can be personal or to a person, but they can also be done for an entire team, and if that's the case, then again, predefined performance indicators which are understood by everyone on the team are very important. And having these in place really can decrease your staff turnover rate, and it also can cause an increase in your team's cohesiveness. Professional development of your staff and employees is also a very important aspect of human resource management, and a good performance review can actually be used to help determine the professional development that is either needed or desired by an individual or an entire team. If you're going to engage in offering professional development to individuals or teams in your organization, then the results of that professional development really should be measurable, meaning that some measure of assessment, such as a skill assessment or an examination or even just personal observation, should be considered both before and after professional development has taken place in order to determine if there has been a change. It's also important to understand the difference between the two terms coaching versus counseling in professional development. Coaching is when you are developing an individual or a team to a higher level of competency, and it really focuses on resolving what an individual or team cannot do, as in doesn't have the ability to do. Giving someone coaching actually can be a very powerful intrinsic motivator for that person as their level of competency begins to increase. By contrast, counseling focuses on resolving what an individual or a team can do, as in does have the ability to do, but just won't for some reason. Occasionally, there can be teams which have a chronically poor performer in its midst. Now, chronically poor performers are more often poorly performing because they're a poor fit for the job that they've been asked to do. In these instances, it's often better to see if you can relocate them to a better fit, where your organization has positions available that would better fit that person's natural talents. However, you can have a chronically poor performer which is due to other factors such as behavioral factors or poor qualifications. And in those instances, it's very important to involve your human resources department early, employ those performance improvement plans, and try to provide opportunities for remediation and then reassess the employee after that has taken place. Obviously, if none of these strategies work, you will have to follow through with termination of employment. If you do have the unhappy task of having to follow through with terminating an employee, then it's very important to make sure that you have followed your organization's policies and procedures, and hopefully that those policies and procedures are very clearly stated. You want to make sure that you communicate appropriately and document, and involve your human resources department very early in this process. Now moving on to team productivity and effectiveness. Just like with individual employees, it's very important to make it clear what a team's goals are supposed to be. In addition to that, you want to define any team rules for how they will operate. And it also can be very important to clarify the individual roles of members on the team, because that's not always intuitive or obvious. We're going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail in the next several slides. When setting goals for your team, it's important to set those goals based on required deliverables for the projects that have been assigned to your team. Some of you may be familiar with setting goals using the SMART method. The SMART method basically means that when you're writing out goals for either an individual or a team, that you include specific parameters that will help you first determine if you've met the goal, and second, to measure the outcome of achieving that goal. To that end, a SMART goal should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, and it should be relevant and time-bound. Now, depending on the resource that you look at, the words making up the SMART acronym may be slightly different. I've included some variations for you here, but they all essentially mean the same thing. You don't want to be nebulous. You want to be able to measure your outcome. You want to set a goal which is actually achievable or realistic. You want to make sure that the goal is relevant to what you're doing and that you have a deadline. When setting tasks to achieve the goal, it's important to identify the specific team member or members who will be responsible for that task. As with any project or goal, it's important to assess baseline data so that you have something to compare it to after the goal or project is completed. While a project or a goal is in flight, it's very important to revisit the goal itself to make sure that the team is on the right track so that you can effect mid-course corrections as needed. Sometimes, even when you think you don't need it, it can be very important to set rules of operation for your team. These are often referred to as ground rules, and they're the rules which establish clear expectations regarding acceptable behavior by team members. It's quite common to see these rules established on online communities. They really help decrease misunderstandings and increase productivity. Rules for operation can include things such as who the team members are, what their roles are, and who they report to, as well as the approach that the team will take to decision making, any resources, timelines, or deliverables, and then a meeting schedule and any requirements for independent work. One way to help establish rules of operation is to use a document called a team charter. Team charters are more commonly used for temporary teams. However, they can also be used for more long-lasting teams that don't have a definitive end date. The components of the team charter are shown in this slide, and they serve as a framework to help team members know how they can expect to make decisions, who's a member of the team, how long the team is expected to last if there is an end date, how the team members will communicate with each other, any financial resources, and so on. When it comes to clarifying individual roles, there are a couple of different tools that you should be aware of for the board examination. The first is an organization chart. Most, if not all of you, have already seen one of these in your own organization. This is traditionally represented as a hierarchical diagram, and it's often organized by department, units, or teams in a hierarchical structure. These charts are a great visual tool for not only representing the roles of individuals within an organization or a team, but also their level of authority and responsibility. Another tool for clarifying individual roles is the Responsibility Assignment Matrix. This is also known as the RACI matrix. This matrix shows the roles or resources assigned to each responsibility or task in a project. The resources are the column headers, and then the responsibilities or activities are on the left-hand side. The data inside the matrix shows the level of responsibility for each person to each task using the RACI acronym. This slide shows what the RACI acronym stands for. R is for responsible and means the person who's responsible for completing the task. Accountable is the person who is accountable to ensure that the task is completed. Often you'll see that the responsible person is also accountable. However, the accountable person may also be the responsible person's supervisor or boss. The consulted person is a person who is consulted regarding decisions for this task, often before they're made. And an informed person is a person who needs to be kept informed of this task's progress, decisions, or actions. This is an example of a responsibility assignment matrix. In this very high-level example, the project is implementing a new EHR. For each task on the left, you can then see the role at the top and whether that person is responsible or accountable or whether they should be consulted or informed. Like most tools used in Section 4 of the core content, the goal is to create a quick visual representation that gives the reader a good idea of what responsibilities each role has in the various aspects of a project. Another tool that can be used for the individual roles in your team is the position description. This is a text document that lists the specific responsibilities of an individual position. It's otherwise known as a job description, and it really is important to have a complete and accurate list of responsibilities because those responsibilities will be used as the benchmarks against which you measure the employee's performance. We're going to move on now to group management processes and managing group deliberations. Again, this is a board examination, so knowledge of named theories and strategies is important, and organizational theory provides information on the way in which people, teams, and organizations behave. Effective use of organizational theory and organizational theory strategies can really help shorten the time, cost, and effort that are needed for projects and operations. A rather well-known organizational theory is called the Tuckman Ladder, in part because of the way that the 5 stages of development are named. The 5 stages of the Tuckman Ladder are listed here. They are listed in order: forming, storming, norming, performing, and lastly, adjourning. In the first stage, forming, the team meets and learns about the project, their various roles and responsibilities, and at this stage you will often see team members, especially if they don't know each other well or at all, tend to be more independent at this stage and less open with each other. In the next stage, called storming, the team begins to work, and during this stage it's very important to foster collaboration and team members being open to each other and to different ideas. If this doesn't happen, you can really start to see a team begin to dysfunction, which is not what you want. The third stage, norming, is where team members really begin to start to adjust their own work habits and behaviors to support the team and also to know who on the team they should go to for various tasks and help. This is where trust really starts to begin. The fourth stage, performing, is the stage that you really want the team to be operating at for the longest possible period of time, because this is where the team operates as a well-organized unit and the team members are interdependent rather than independent. So unlike the first 3 stages where the focus is on facilitating development such that the team can pass to the next stage as quickly as possible, in the performing stage you really want to focus on maintenance, maintaining that performing stage until the project is ready to close or the team is going to be disbanded. So then the last stage is adjourning, which is the only one that doesn't rhyme with the first 4, is when the team is being disbanded, usually because the project itself is closing. When building team effectiveness, training a team together really can help foster progression of the team through these various stages and into the performing stage. Team building activities which are not training per se can also be used to help foster these efforts. Speaking of building team effectiveness, you should be aware of 2 different types of teams, especially in this day and age of information technology, because the way in which you would build team effectiveness and progress your team through the stages of the Tuckman Ladder will be different depending on where the team members are located. So the first type of team is known as a co-location team. I've also seen it referenced to as a type matrix, although I don't usually hear that in common parlance. A co-location team basically means that the team members are co-located together. Typically, most if not all of the team members are in the same physical space, and the goal is really to enhance performance as a team. There's a lot of advantages to this approach. You have a lot of personal communication, there's a lot of nonverbal communication along with verbal, and the second major advantage is that by pulling team members out of their typical environments, you can help improve the individual's focus on the project, especially when you have team members who are in typically high distraction environments. By contrast, a virtual team is a team with a shared goal that actually spend very little or no time in meetings face-to-face. These are meetings which occur via email or web conferencing, instant message, social media, etc. There are a lot of advantages to this approach as well, especially nowadays. You can have teams where the members are in any particular place or even country, and you don't have to pay the fees to have them travel to the site where the other team members are. This also increases the availability of experts who may not be local to where the team is working. It also allows for teleworking and flexibility for staff shift schedules as well, particularly if you have international team members in the group. Because travel is not required, this can also facilitate inclusion of individuals who may have mobility issues. And because you're not paying for travel expenses, it can be more cost efficient. However, the disadvantages are that your team members don't have the advantage of the full set of nonverbal communication. There are often ancillary discussions which may happen outside of web conferencing or email that would occur in a co-location team but which would not occur in a virtual team. So you can see that the stages of the Tuckman Ladder are slower with a virtual team than with a co-location team. Conflict management was addressed in Section 4A on leadership, and a brief amount of decision making was also covered. So here we're going to address group decision making in some more detail. As stated in Section 4A on leadership, there are distinct advantages to making a decision as a group. Groups offer you the opportunity to have members within them that may have a diverse set of experiences, cultural backgrounds, and job responsibilities, and these can really help facilitate high-quality decisions, in part because the group has a greater collective understanding of the impact that a decision may have. In addition, decisions made by a group often have better buy-in from the group and adoption of the new workflow that comes as a result of the decision. The disadvantages, however, in group decision-making are that decisions made by a group typically take a longer period of time than with a single individual, and in addition, there are certain cognitive biases, which are also known as process losses in this literature, that may need to be avoided and/or mitigated. These cognitive biases can lead to poorer decisions made by the group than if an individual person was making the decision, and you're really losing the benefit of having the diversity and different opinions and experiences of members in the group when these cognitive biases are allowed to continue. The first cognitive bias is groupthink. This is a process whereby individuals are pressured to conform to this dominant view in the group, and any dissenting views can actively be suppressed either by social peer pressure or by a very dominant member of the group. Alternative courses are therefore not fully explored, so the decision that you make is not likely to be as good as a result, and this cognitive bias is more often seen in highly cohesive groups that have a dominant leader. Bandwagon effect is actually a form of groupthink in which a person in the group believes something to be true simply just because other members of the group do. So bandwagon is a type of groupthink, and you should be aware of it just in case it's asked about in the board exam. The last cognitive bias is group polarization. This is an interesting phenomenon whereby you see the tendency of a group to entertain more risky or extreme or polar end solutions to a problem than they did before the group began discussing the topic. This is where you have a lot of like-minded people who get into a group who start discussing a topic, and you find that the individual members of the group begin to have more extreme or polarized ideas after they've had the group discussion than before it started. This is in part due to the fact that when you have other members of the group who share your ideas, there's this feeling that any potential negative consequences made based on a decision that the group makes are perceived to be diffused throughout the whole group. There are 3 common approaches to group decision making which are specifically referenced in the core content for the board examination. And these are nominal group technique, consensus mapping, and the Delphi method. In the nominal group method, group members individually and privately develop their own ideas or proposed solutions in writing. And then each group member would share one item from their list, and you would continue around the group team members until all of the ideas or alternatives to a particular decision are publicly recorded, such as on a whiteboard or a flip chart. It is imperative at this stage that no criticism or analysis occur, because in this method you are really trying to facilitate everyone getting all of their ideas out on the table, and you don't want to encourage the groupthink phenomenon that was described earlier. The group would then engage in discussion or analysis of all of the options on the table, and then they would conclude with what is known as multi-voting, where the group members will rank or rate each one of the options, and the highest ranked option among all of the team members is chosen. The advantages of the nominal group method are that it really does promote participation of all of the team members and considers all of the ideas and has steps which actively prohibit groupthink. The disadvantage is that this approach is not very flexible, it is quite prescriptive, and it isn't necessarily the most efficient way to address different ideas about multiple related subjects or problems. The best application for nominal group technique is to help generate efficient discussion regarding a single problem or situation when there are multiple possible ways to solve that problem. And this is why multi-voting is used, as you will see when we talk about multi-voting a little bit later in this lecture. The next decision-making method that is specifically mentioned in your core content is consensus mapping. Consensus mapping involves a facilitator and a group reaching consensus about how best to arrange or sequence multiple interrelated activities into a usable plan of action. So, for example, if you are implementing a new information system, which is department-wide or facility-wide, where there are a lot of moving departments and pieces and people, then this might be a method that you would wish to employ when determining the sequence and steps of the project plan. Consensus mapping is based upon an expectation of compromise. Not everyone is going to get what they want, but everyone should get some of what they want out of the final decision. Like the nominal group method, consensus mapping is a very prescriptive method. There are 7 steps, and they are listed on the next 2 slides. The first step is to create a master list of all ideas, tasks, or projects under consideration. The second is to form small groups, and these would be 2 to 4 task groups, and each of them ideally would be somewhere between 5 and 9 people. Each one of the groups will be tasked with clustering the ideas or tasks into related categories. Within an individual group, there may be subgroups of 2 or 3 people which will perform their own clustering of tasks and then merge those into the group's clustering by consensus. The third step is that the groups will then come back together into a large group to do review and reevaluation of the ideas after they've had an opportunity to cluster them and then bring those clusters back to the large group. In step 4, the facilitators of the group at large will create a straw man map of the integrated clusters, and then they will present this map to the entire group. In the 5th phase, the small groups will break out again and they will do map reconfiguration. In step 6, there will be another large group presentation, and finally in stage 7, there's map consolidation. The advantage of consensus mapping is that if you have a project where you have a large number of interrelated or interdependent elements, consensus mapping can really help you organize that into the appropriate sequence of steps. This is in contrast to nominal group, where nominal group really is good at helping you make a decision about one problem or situation where there are multiple possible solutions. In consensus mapping, just like in nominal group, each team member has the opportunity to provide input and opinions. However, in consensus mapping, the solution is predicated on the agreement or acceptance of all of the team members. Multi-voting, which is used in nominal group method, is different in that there is a vote and the highest ranked solution is picked, which may not necessarily mean that all team members voted for that particular solution. So a bit of a nuanced difference, but an important one if you're being asked questions about the differences. The biggest disadvantage to consensus mapping is that it really works best with a trained, experienced group of people because you have a facilitator, groups, and subgroups. You're asking people to cluster tasks together. If they haven't done this before, that process could be very slow. The third group decision-making method listed in the core content is the Delphi method. On this slide, I have put in a picture of the oracle at Delphi because this method was named after this very important shrine in ancient Greece where people would come from all over Greece and beyond to have their questions about the future answered by an expert. In the case of the oracle at Delphi, this was the Pythia, or the priestess of Apollo. In the case of the Delphi method, these are a panel of experts that you have brought into a group in order to ask them to predict the future based on their expertise. Now, unlike the oracle at Delphi, the Delphi method is a very systematic and interactive forecasting method, which relies on a panel of experts. And it was originally developed by the RAND Corporation in the 1950s. And interestingly enough, it was intended to help forecast the impact of technology on warfare. There is a graphic image on the slide to depict how the method works, but we're going to go through this in a little more detail in the next few slides. So the first step in the Delphi method is that after having assembled your panel of experts, you're going to develop questionnaires and have those experts answer those questionnaires individually in 2 or more rounds. After each round of questions that you have asked your experts, in which you are asking them to forecast what they think is going to happen in the future, a facilitator will provide an anonymous summary of those experts' forecasts from the previous round and any reasons that the experts may have had for providing judgments on why they think certain things are going to happen in the future. Then, the experts are going to be encouraged to revise their earlier answers in light of this anonymized summary provided by the facilitators. The fourth phase in the Delphi method is to continue this iterative process where the experts provide their forecasts, the facilitators summarize and anonymize that feedback, and then phase 4 stops and phase 5 begins when the process stops due to a predefined criterion having been met, such as the number of rounds or complete achievement of consensus. The last phase in the Delphi method is that the mean or median scores of the final rounds will help determine the final forecast or the results. The advantages of the Delphi method are that it can be conducted without face-to-face meetings, and it can accommodate opinions from a large number of subject matter experts. It can also be conducted anonymously, which can be helpful if the forecasting that you're doing is politically or emotionally charged. And because people are not face-to-face, this method really minimizes bandwagon effect, groupthink, and group polarization. The disadvantages, as you might imagine, are that the range of opinions or forecasts can be as diverse as the experts in the group, and sometimes you actually can have a bit of bandwagon effect or groupthink because the best written opinions may sway the group's opinion, and the facilitators may also introduce bias by the way that they summarize the information. In the project management body of knowledge, they give a prescriptive process for completing group decision-making in a 6-phase model. In the first phase, the group should define the problem. The second phase involves brainstorming to try to get all the ideas out onto the table. The third phase is where those ideas are evaluated and one is selected. And then the fourth phase is where action planning for implementing a solution takes place. In phase 5, you're going to plan then how you're going to evaluate the decision that is made by the group. And then in phase 6, you're going to actually evaluate the decision that was made by the group. How well was the problem solved? Did the process work? Etc. There are other methods that can be used to help facilitate group decision making, and some of these are listed here. One that's very commonly used is brainstorming, where you ask all the members of the group to contribute ideas. At this stage of the game, there's no good or bad idea. They just want to get everything out onto the table, and then they'll be evaluated afterwards. Some groups will use idea or mind mapping or affinity diagrams. These allow you to visually map parent-child and other relationships in a very fast manner that creates a visual diagram that's easy for the groups to see. Then there's also multi-criteria decision analysis, which is a decision matrix way of handling decisions where you are evaluating and ranking many ideas. There are also process decision program charts. Again, these can be found in the project management body of knowledge. These are often used to help understand the goal in relation to the steps that are needed to achieve that goal, and they can be very useful in contingency planning. Interrelationship diagrams are an adaptation of relationship diagrams for complex problem solving of up to 50 relevant items. The details of each one of these can be found in your references. So let's take a break and consider another question. Which of the following group decision-making methods is based on the expectation of compromise? The Delphi Method, consensus mapping, groupthink, or nominal group? And the correct answer is consensus mapping. So again, consensus mapping is a group decision-making process which is very prescriptive. It involves a facilitator and multiple groups who are trying to sequence multiple interrelated activities. And this is a process that you might use, for example, when you're trying to figure out all of the tasks and the sequence of those tasks that will be required in order to implement a new EHR. This process is based on an expectation of compromise among all the groups involved in the process. The Delphi method is a method of forecasting, whereas groupthink is a cognitive bias that can be seen in groups in which members of the group feel pressured to conform to a dominant view. Nominal group is a decision-making method which uses multi-voting in order to choose the highest ranked option for a single decision. Moving on now to managing meetings. If you are involved in clinical informatics, there is a very good likelihood that a large portion of your day is consumed by meetings. As we just discussed, having a group involved in a discussion in a meeting can give you certain advantages when it comes to decision making, but it also can make the group prone to certain cognitive biases, which then may result in a poorer decision at the end of the day if they aren't mitigated. Similarly, if meetings are not managed properly, they can be a great source of time inefficiency, and therefore it's really important that you manage your meetings well. Various advice that you will see in the medical literature states to make sure that you've determined whether a meeting is really necessary, how long that meeting will take, and you should be aware of Parkinson's law, which says that work will magically expand to fill the time available for its completion. In my own career, I've seen many meetings scheduled for an hour that really only needed 15 minutes, and somehow the conversation managed to take a full hour in the meeting. This is really a source of time inefficiency that you want to avoid. Effective management of meetings also means that you need to determine the venue ahead of time, whether that meeting should be face-to-face versus a web-based conference or teleconference, and recurring meetings should really be limited unless absolutely necessary. The participants in the meeting should be chosen wisely. Who you include is just as important as who you don't, and scheduling the meeting should really only be done if the key people and decision makers can be present. Other aspects to effective meeting preparation include developing and distributing a very clear agenda, putting time limits on each agenda item, and you want to identify the participants that are needed to accomplish the specific tasks on the agenda, gather and distribute your materials and pre-work needed to accomplish the agenda before the meeting takes place. At the beginning of the meeting, particularly for those meetings that have a lot of items being discussed or activities, it's important to make sure that 3 roles have been assigned. The facilitator who leads the meeting, the timekeeper who makes sure that your time-limited agenda items are being addressed and you're staying on top of the agenda in a timely manner, and a scribe who writes down the minutes of the meeting. The purpose of the meeting should be clearly stated at the beginning of the meeting, and the agenda should be reviewed. Any new members or guests to the meeting should be introduced, and the ground rules for operation should either be stated or given to the group as a reminder so that the group's conversation can occur in a productive way. During the meeting, it is the facilitator's job to make sure that the group is adhering to the pre-established rules of operation. Behaviors that break the ground rules should be redirected. The scribe should be recording the key points during the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, the decisions that were made by the group should be restated, and an action plan should be developed which includes each action item, the person responsible for that action item, and the date of expected completion. After each meeting, the scribe should generate minutes for distribution, which should include the attendance, the decisions made, and the list of action items. The group members should be given the opportunity to review and edit those minutes, and group members who were not present but who have been assigned action items should specifically be notified about those action items. Managing group deliberations is listed in the section on effective interdisciplinary teams. However, this was already covered in section 4A on leadership by describing negotiation and conflict management. We're going to move now into section 4C, which is communications. This is also section 4.3 in your core content. These are the elements of the core content for this section. So let's start first with the definition of effective communication. Effective communication is communication or information that's provided in the right format, at the right time, to the right audience, and with the right impact. Efficient communication is providing only the information that is needed without extraneous information that doesn't contribute meaningfully to the passage of information from one person to another. There are multiple spectra of communications, and these spectra, when you evaluate them for the specific communication that you are planning, can have an impact on how and when you decide to communicate information. So for example, if you're creating an internal memo versus a piece of information that you're going to put on your public website, the language that you use and the information that you provide may be different. Similarly, if you are engaging in a very formal communication versus a very informal communication, how you decide to communicate may be very different. Vertical and horizontal communication. So horizontal communication would be an example of 2 colleagues communicating with each other, whereas vertical communication is when a subordinate is communicating with his or her superior or vice versa. Obviously, you can have official and unofficial communications, written versus oral, and verbal versus nonverbal. Berlow in 1960 developed a basic communication model which is still valid today. In this model, you have a sender and a receiver who are represented by the stick figures on the page. And the sender produces a message and then encodes that message into some form of communication medium. It can be verbal, it can be a printed page, or nonverbal. The message then transmits to the receiver with varying degrees of noise. The receiver then receives the message and decodes it after they have filtered out the noise, and then the receiver may or may not acknowledge the message by sending feedback to the sender via the same process. A successful communication is one in which the receiver understood the message as it was intended to be understood by the sender. The reason why communication is called out in this core content is because I think, as everyone knows, poor communication is the #1 reason for accidents and errors in healthcare. It's estimated that only 30% of most verbal messages are accurately understood by the receiver. And this is the reason why the Joint Commission and other accreditation organizations require a read back and verify for critically important information. When we talk about communication, most people think about the distribution of information in an effective and accurate manner. However, it's important to realize that one of the most important elements of communication is listening. There are three major types of communication: oral, written, and nonverbal. In oral communication, vocal intonation can communicate a lot of information that would be completely missed if looking at information on a printed page. Similarly, nonverbal communication, meaning body language and facial expressions, can also be really helpful for a receiver to determine the intent behind a message that can be missed with both written communications as well as some oral communications. The concept of information richness or media richness theory was developed by Daft and Langle beginning in 1984. And this theory presents communication as occurring on a spectrum from rich to lean. Rich communication is communication in which you're getting a lot more other than just the words involved in communication. This would include vocal intonation. It would include nonverbal cues such as facial expressions or body language. This type of communication is the least prone to communication error because all of those vocal and nonverbal cues help the receiver understand the intent behind the message. However, face-to-face and verbal conversations can take more time and can be expensive if you are bringing people in to a face-to-face meeting who may have to travel. In the middle of the rich to lean spectrum are audio-only communications where there are no visual cues present. This includes telephone conversations and audio recordings. On the lean end of the spectrum, there are no audio or nonverbal cues, and this is typically represented by written information. This would include things like email, memos, websites, posters, and flyers. The lean aspect of the spectrum is the most prone to communication error because you're lacking all of those vocal intonation or nonverbal cues. On the flip side, it is a very fast and cheap way to disseminate large amounts of information, and unlike unrecorded face-to-face communications or verbal communications, written communications are the least dependent on subjective memory. Therefore, when preparing an effective communication, it's first and foremost important to identify and characterize the target audience who will be receiving your information. Knowing whether you're communicating to an individual versus a group, the age, or as I prefer to refer to it now, is the level of experience of your target audience, their level of education, any socioeconomic or cultural factors that may be at play, the level of expertise on the topic in which the communication is taking place, and also the anticipated communication forum. For example, is this going to be a face-to-face meeting versus a written communication? Any possible resistance or confusion should be anticipated and mitigated, and then if you have a choice about the method of communication, you should choose an appropriate method for the type of content that is going to be delivered. We're going to move on to the next section, which is effective presentations to groups. Many of you taking this course are already giving presentations to groups, either within your own institution or at the local or national levels. So much of the content throughout this lecture should be common sense, but as they are in the core content, they are fair game for questions. Preparing for a lecture is much like preparing for a negotiation. If you fail to prepare, then you can prepare to fail. It's important that you know your material, and it's also really important to check out the venue and the equipment the day before, particularly for more formal lectures, such as those that you would give at national and international meetings. If it is a formal lecture that you're giving, or a presentation to a group, then practicing your presentation to the group is very important, especially as you are creating segues from slide to slide, for example. In cases where you may be giving a presentation to people you don't know, it often helps to try to reduce some anonymity with the audience, and of course this depends on the size of the audience, but you can chat with the participants as they get seated. And it's also important to know how to shake hands well, because as many of you may have experienced, a bad handshake is often a poor impression left. It's important to be authoritative during your talk, but don't talk too fast. I found in my own experience that when I took my lecture to a higher level so that I could speak more slowly, the evaluations were better at the end of the day. If you're in a more informal group setting, then the information covered in section 4B earlier in this lecture regarding committee meetings and how to manage them would apply. When communicating with groups, there are 3 basic communication methods that you can use. The first is interactive. This is where you are stating information and then receiving feedback from the conference or group participants. This is certainly the most efficient way to ensure that information was understood by the recipients because you're receiving constant feedback, and it also ensures that the recipients received the information. But the disadvantages are that you can only really do this with a limited number of people, and while you certainly can get feedback from a small number of participants when you're presenting to a large group, for example during the Q&A session, it is certainly difficult to make sure that all of the participants in a large lecture hall, for example, have received your communication as you intended for it to be received. The interactive method of communication is best used when you're in small to medium-sized meetings, phone calls, instant messaging, and video conferencing. The push model of communication means that you're pushing out information to specific people who need it. This is very efficient in communication distribution, but unfortunately does not ensure the understanding of the people receiving your message, or even whether they are receiving the message at all. These types of communications are often letters, reports, faxes, voicemail, blogs, press releases. The last model of communication is the pull method, where recipients actually must initiate accessing the information. This is very useful when you have large volumes of information that are not easily amenable to distribution. They also can be very useful for extremely large audiences, such as the entire world. And if you set up these types of pull communications correctly, you can actually track who pulled the information, which will help you determine who received it and who didn't. You can also include competency tests to assess the recipient's understanding of the information. However, recipients may not know that the information exists in order to go retrieve it, nor may they have time to retrieve it. I think many of us have heard from our providers that if it takes them more than 1 or 2 clicks to get to the information, they may go to another source or not retrieve the information at all. Common methods of pull communication are intranet sites, this clinical informatics board review course, the online version in an e-learning module, and other knowledge repositories. Now let's discuss effective one-on-one communication. Again, in communication, listening and asking questions in order to make sure that you are understanding the other person is critically important in effective communication. Unfortunately, in medicine, where we almost always feel rushed to get things done as quickly as possible, this can sometimes feel very counterintuitive. As physicians, because we hold a higher status in most healthcare institutions than many of the people with whom we are communicating, it's very important to be as non-threatening as possible, and it also helps to avoid having any kind of physical barrier between you and the person that you're communicating with. For example, when communicating, avoid sitting behind your desk, and it also helps to put your head at the same level as the other person. These are effective strategies to use not only when communicating with staff, but also when communicating with your patients. It's also important to understand that the other person may have certain cultural beliefs or expectations, certain organizational history or experiences or work beliefs that could be influencing how they're receiving information from you. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to ask the other person you're communicating with questions about why they feel certain ways or why they assumed certain things based off of a communication, because there could be important history or other facts that you don't know which would help you communicate with that individual better in the future. In one-on-one communication, it is sometimes preferable to use richer channels of communication where vocal intonation and nonverbal cues can be available, and this is certainly true if the topic is difficult or is at risk of being misinterpreted or not well received. Obviously, it's also important to have integrity. People need to be able to trust what you say, and they also need to know that when something is important that you will tell them. Again, as previously stated on the last side, it's very important to invite feedback. Tell me what I am missing, did I answer your question, etc. Now, as you might imagine, one-on-one communication and face-to-face meetings are not always possible, and many of us spend much of our time writing lots of emails. So writing effectively is a critical skill for clinical informaticists as well as others. As many of you already know and has been previously discussed, written communication is always going to be a very lean channel of communication, and therefore it is very easy for a reader to misinterpret what you have written. Therefore, it's really important to write clearly and simply, to be direct about what you mean. And again, it's important to remember your audience. The average adult American comprehends written language at an 8th grade level, but some will tell you that it's really a 5th grade level. It's important to make use of bold and underline and highlighting for key concepts in your writing, as well as for white space, as white space around important pieces of information can help highlight that information without leaving the reader feeling like you are yelling at them. Similarly, it's important not to write long paragraphs, as information can often be buried in the middle of a paragraph, and this makes it hard for users to tease that information out. Another effective tool for both verbal communication as well as for written communication is the SBAR method. SBAR stands for the 4 components of communication, the first being situation, followed by background, assessment, and recommendation. This method of communication is promoted in many healthcare systems in order to ensure effective communication of a problem that needs immediate or near immediate resolution. The situation is effectively a statement of the problem. The background is a brief summary of events that led to the situation or problem. The assessment is the communicator's assessment of that situation and then their recommendations on how to fix it. Obviously, you don't want your written communications to make you seem illiterate, so it is important to have correct spelling and grammar. It's also important not, where possible, to have typos, as in certain situations those typos can be disastrous. Voice recognition on your phone seems to be a particular area where things can go awry. Certainly, if the topic is difficult, it is better to choose a richer form of communication, such as a phone call, but if really difficult, in person is always better. If written communication is the only option, sometimes it can be very helpful to have another person or several people read the message before you send it. Here's an example of poorly written communication, which I'm going to read out loud simply because it can really highlight just how difficult it would be for a receiver to decode this message. Hey, as you know, we had a meeting last week regarding the situation we discussed the week before, and many members of the team thought that we should talk to you about it and get your feedback. The new equipment is working well, but we have some concerns about some of the options and whether they will work for that area in the hospital. Since I haven't had much time lately, my colleague has been taking over most of my duties. I already have some feedback, so you don't have to attend the meeting if you don't want to. Just let me know what you want to do. Sincerely, Fred. Now, I don't know about you, but this communication would leave me with a lot of questions, which we'll go through on the next slide. So the problems with this communication are multiple. Let's just begin with the salutation. It just says, hey. If this email were sent to multiple people, none of us would know who was being asked these questions or being asked for feedback. Secondly, what on earth is the situation that this person is referring to? Which team are they referring to? And who are the members of the team who wanted to get my feedback or someone's feedback in the group? What equipment, what area, what on earth do Fred's duties being covered by someone else have anything to do with this email? And if the team wanted my feedback, why are they telling me that I don't need to attend the meeting? Needless to say, I'm left at the end of the day being extremely confused and needing to ask a lot of questions for clarification, which is not very time efficient. Rather than leave you with just a poor example, we're going to take that same communication and reword it to be much clearer. Dear Alexis, the Specimen Collection Positive Patient ID team discussed at our meeting last week the unexpectedly large number of duplicate specimen labels printing in the specimen processing area. The vendor representative for this project cannot identify the source. What the team needs from you, please examine the labels and propose possible sources of the duplication. The deadline is tomorrow, October 1st. The new label printing equipment is otherwise working well, but we have some additional concerns that we would like to discuss with you at our next project meeting on October 7th. Please let us know if you can join us. Sincerely, Fred. So in the poorly written example that I gave you earlier, that communication had 106 words. This more well-written example has 98 words. So it is actually shorter. And in addition to that, it is far more clear. There is an appropriate use of font colors, bold, underline, and white space to help the reader understand the important information that's needed from them right away, as well as what might be needed in the future. Obviously, electronic health records can also be used as a rather constant written communication tool. While electronic health records are more often used as a pull method of communication, they also can be used, as you know, as a push method of communication, such as alerts when you first log in to the EHR. As with all written communication, the electronic health record is a means of communicating using lean rather than rich channels. And because of that, people have often complained that the electronic health record will actually decrease their situational awareness because they don't have as much interpersonal action either with patients or with members of the healthcare team. Its current design is not ideal in hectic environments, and especially in situations where communication has to happen with lightning speed. This is why landline telephones, cellular telephones, and text messaging are important components of healthcare which don't typically exist in the EHR. Similarly, because EHRs are often localized to an institution, transitioning a patient from one facility to another when the EHRs at those two locations are different requires the use of verbal and manual documentation rather than communication via the electronic health record. Even when transitioning a patient from one unit to another in the same facility, verbal communication from a human who has been able to synthesize the record as a whole into a few brief short statements can be extremely helpful, because many of you know that complicated patients often have a huge amount of documentation in an electronic health record, and it can sometimes be difficult to find a summary that tells you what you need to know right now. Another thing to consider in an electronic health record is that an electronic health record serves many target audiences who have different levels of education and understanding as well as perspectives. This can create a real challenge in some electronic health records. It is the reason why electronic health records have a number of different types of screens for people to view, but you should also be aware that that data in the electronic health record may also be used for the electronic health records embedded patient portal, as well as being given to patients when it's requested from a medical records department as part of the patient's designated record set. To give you a similar example, pathology reports are written for physicians, and many of them, when they're read by a patient, can be hard to understand at best to, in some cases, completely indecipherable. And in these cases, lean communication really does not work very well. This is why it's important for physicians to be able to have that one-on-one communication with patients, because then patients are allowed to ask questions and to have things put in terms that they understand. As a small side note, there is a small movement within the pathology informatics community to try to translate pathology reports into more patient-friendly documents, but that is in its very early stages of development. Many of you probably have seen the term TMI, or too much information, used in text messaging, especially if you have younger children. Too much information in healthcare can lead to information overload and can actually result in decreased communication, because what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of noise to the amount of signal and therefore decreasing that signal to noise ratio. If information is being delivered primarily by alerts, then obviously you can get alert fatigue. And this is also described elsewhere in this board review course. Some of you may have experienced the impact of note writing in an EHR, where one provider copies and pastes and then edits a note from another provider in order to prevent from retyping all of that information. When this occurs, there's a risk of copying and pasting so much information that much of it does not get read, and important information within that note may be missed. Developing an effective communications program is very important for a clinical informaticist, because we are involved in change so much of the time in the organization, and communications about those changes need to go out frequently. Therefore, we are constantly having to maintain a balance between telling people what they need to know and not overloading them. So let's begin with a communication plan. A communication plan is a predefined agreement between various parties on a particular project for the communication of information. When developing a communication plan, it's important to remember who, what, where, when, why, and how. So for who, it is who's going to get the communication. What is the information that will be communicated? Where is the expected or possible locations of the persons who are going to be receiving the communication? And this matters because that will influence the how, or the method or medium of your communication. When is the timing of the communication? Is this something that's going to go out immediately versus periodically? And if periodically, what's the frequency? And then also why, triggers or reasons for the communication. A communication plan also includes whether there are constraints on communication. For example, are only certain people allowed to do communicating in certain situations? It also needs to include the escalation process for urgent issues, change control for the communications plan itself, flowcharts of communication, again, because these are visual representations that really help give people a quick overview as to how information is supposed to flow, and the mechanism for receipt, review, and response to feedback from that communication. If certain communications have to be approved before they can be sent out, then that approval process needs to be described. A stakeholder register can really help drive the development of a communication plan, and we will cover stakeholder registers in section 4D of this course. In this slide, I've given you an example of a communication plan, and you should be aware that there are many different types of communication plan structures out there. I've seen some communication plans that actually have the entire project schedule month by month in a Gantt-like fashion in the communication plan so that they have a specific schedule for certain types of communication. In this document, you'll see that there's just a trigger, when, immediate versus periodic, and a frequency, but some project managers may prefer to put them on an actual schedule in order to be able to determine which communications go out on which weeks, for example. So we're going to talk about this next subject by using a question. So we haven't discussed the training of end users, but the question is, training of end users on a new information system should be completed, A, as early as possible prior to rollout of the new system to give users as much time as possible to become familiar with the new system before go live, B, only following the rollout of the new system after the bugs are worked out to prevent staff from wasting their time, C, prior to the rollout of the new system so that staff are prepared to use the new system at go live, but not so early that they don't forget their training on the new system, and D, on a time frame according to the seniority of staff so that staff who have been employed the longest should be trained first. So as many of you have already probably guessed, the answer is C. You want to give end users training as close to go live as possible because this minimizes the risk that they will have forgotten their training by the time you reach the day of go live. The amount of time that's spent in training also has to be balanced against the number of end users that need to be trained. Obviously, for larger numbers of users, it's going to take more time for trainers to train them. And really, for any training that needs to be done more than 2 months prior to the go live, quick refresher courses should likely be planned right before go live so that end users will be able to remember how they are supposed to operate in the new system. Obviously, seniority should never be a factor in who gets trained first. Instead, it should be dependent on which groups of end users will be using the system first, particularly for staged go-lives. There's one additional resource I do want to mention, and that is William Zinsser's book called On Writing Well. This book was intended originally for journalists and book writers to help them write effectively, but it is also really helpful for anyone trying to communicate in written form. That's a wrap for this lecture. Thank you so much for sticking it out to the end.